They said humanity was late to the stars. They were right. Every species that found the void first had millions of years on us. The Varrock had sung between nebulae before Earth's oceans cooled. The Solin had mapped 100,000 worlds before the first human ever looked up at the moon and thought, what if we were the youngest, the newest, the ones who arrived at the great galactic table after every seat was taken, smiled politely, and sat on the floor. They called us the latecomers. Some called us worse. We did not argue. We built, quietly, stubbornly, the way humans always build, with bad tools, worse odds, and a particular kind of jaw-set determination that no other species had ever quite managed to name. The Varrock had a word for it that translated loosely as the madness of the groundborn. The Solin didn't have a word. They just watched us and kept their children close. For 200 years, humanity kept its head down, traded, learned, shook hands, or the 17-limbed equivalent, with everyone who'd allow it. We made no enemies we couldn't afford. We made no promises we couldn't keep. We asked for nothing except room. We were given less than that. And still we built. Fleets the galaxy never asked about. Weapons no treaty restricted because no one thought to restrict them. Soldiers trained in the particular hell of Earth's own making, because Earth had never had the luxury of a peaceful history. We were the species that had spent 10,000 years trying to kill each other and had somehow, barely, made it out the other side. That history was embarrassing in polite galactic company. It would save them all, because on the day the Keth came, the day the sky over 100 worlds turned black with something older and hungrier than anything the galaxy had a name for, humanity was the only species that didn't freeze. We'd seen monsters before. We'd been monsters before. We knew exactly what to do. This is the story of the day the galaxy fell into chaos, and the day humanity's Armada arrived to fight beside them. The first signal came from the Varrock border worlds, and it was not a distress call. Distress calls have structure. Frequency, header, identification code, the kind of organized panic that a civilization millions of years old has had time to standardize and systematize and turn into something manageable. The Varrock had protocols for every category of disaster. Stellar events, plague, political collapse, even war. They had a specific emergency frequency for war, because war, like everything else in their ancient civilization, had been given a proper procedure. What came from the border world of Vethcarol was none of those things. It was 63 seconds of audio. No hither, no identification, just sound. And the sound was every living thing on a planet of 400 million people screaming at exactly the same moment. Then silence. Then nothing. Not jamming. Not static. Nothing, the way a hole in the world is nothing. The signal didn't stop transmitting. It simply stopped existing. The Galactic Accord received the recording at 0347 standard hours. By 0400, every senior intelligence officer in the Accord's 12-species coalition was awake, staring at the same data, and arriving at the same conclusion with a particular shared horror of people who have just understood something they cannot understand. Vethcarol had a population of 400 million. The silence had taken 11 seconds. Not 11 minutes. Not 11 hours. 11 seconds and 400 million voices had ended together, not in the chaotic, staggered way of a catastrophe moving across a surface, but simultaneously the way you'd turn off a light. Senior Commander Ela Voss of the Accord's Joint Intelligence Bureau was the one who pulled the human file. Not because she was ordered to, because she was the only one in the room whose hands were still steady, and she needed something to do with them before the shaking started. She was Solin. Her people had mapped 100,000 worlds. They had seen things that would collapse a younger species into catatonia. She had personally overseen the documentation of 3 extinction-level events in her 400-year career. Her hands were shaking. She pulled the human file because the humans had requested observer status on the Accord's Emergency Intelligence Council 3 years ago, and the council had said no, and she had voted with the majority, and she had never once thought about that vote since. She thought about it now. The file was thick. Humans had only been a recognized spacefaring species for 2 centuries, which was nothing, a blink, but they had spent those 2 centuries accumulating data the way their homeworld's oceans accumulated salt, constantly, in every direction, without apparent effort or limit. Their intelligence archives were absurdly large for a young species. Disproportionately large. The kind of large that made you realize, when you looked at the file size, that they had been paying attention to things the older species had stopped noticing. The Keth were in the file. Not much. Humanity didn't have much. But there were 17 cross-referenced entries, and each one was tagged with the same internal Terran intelligence classification. Priority Omega. Do not archive. Ela Voss read the tag. Her translator rendered it perfectly. Then, she did something she had not done in 400 years of professional service. She used the emergency contact protocol for a non-Accord member species. She called Earth. Admiral Sarah Nakamura was eating breakfast when a call came through. Real breakfast. Eggs from a farm on Titan's agricultural ring. Bread baked in the galley 3 hours before her watch started. Coffee from a blend that her chief of staff had spent 6 months sourcing from 3 different colony worlds because Nakamura had once mentioned, offhandedly, that pre-expansion Colombian coffee was the only thing she genuinely missed about being groundside. She was eating it standing up because she was always standing up because she had learned during her first command that a captain who sat down during a meal gave the crew the impression that nothing was urgent, and on a vessel like the Ter's Unconquerable, nothing being urgent was a state Nakamura could not afford a project. The call came in on the emergency channel. Not Terran emergency. Appel emergency. The channel that humanity had been given provisional access to as a courtesy, that they had never once been expected to actually use. She put the coffee down. She didn't think about it. Her hand just put it down. Nakamura, she said. The voice on the other end was Solène. The harmonic layering in the vowels gave it away. And it was afraid. Nakamura had dealt with Solène for 20 years. She knew what afraid sounded like in their register, the way a certain upper frequency dropped out of their speech when the emotion hit hard enough. Admiral Nakamura. A pause. My name is Ela Voss. Accord Joint Intelligence. I'm calling outside protocol because there's no protocol for this, and I have read your species file on the Keth, and I need to know how much of that file is operational. Nakamura was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then all of it. Another pause. Longer. 400 million people on Veth Carol died 11 seconds ago, Voss said. We have received similar signals from 3 additional border systems in the last 17 minutes. The Accord's joint fleet is, we are assembling. We do not know what we are assembling against. Your file used the term consumption event. Can you tell me what that means? Nakamura picked up her coffee, drank the rest of it, set the cup down again. It means, she said, that the Keth don't invade. They don't conquer. They move through a region of space, and they metabolize it. Every organic structure, every living system. They don't want your worlds. They want what's on your worlds. Silence on the other end. We've been tracking their approach vector for 9 years, Nakamura said. We filed 3 formal intelligence reports with the Accord. All 3 were classified as speculative and non-actionable. She kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level. I'd like to speak with whoever's running the Joint Fleet Assembly right now. That would be Grand Admiral Theres of the Varek First Armada. Connect me. A beat, please. Grand Admiral Theres had been commanding warships for 600 years. He had fought the Selene-Varek border conflicts of the previous millennium. He had suppressed 3 internal Accord rebellions. He had overseen the only successful military action against the Dreth Collective in recorded history, a campaign that was still studied in every military academy across 12 species as a masterwork of strategic patience and overwhelming force. He had never lost a fleet engagement. He had never seen anything like the data feeds coming in from the border. For systems, in 31 minutes. Not fallen, consumed. The Accord's long-range sensors were showing something at the edge of their resolution that defied categorization. Not ships, not weapon signatures. Something that moved the way a tide moves, not pointed in a direction, but rising, covering everything in its path with the indifference of a natural event. The Varek First Armada was 2,000 vessels strong. The finest ships ever built by the oldest surviving spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy. Weapons that could crack a moon. Shields that had never been measured past their limits, because nothing had ever pushed them that far. Theres looked at the sensor data. He called in his senior staff. He looked at their faces. He watched 600 years of military experience reach the same conclusion his own mind had just arrived at, and he watched every one of them try to find a way out of that conclusion, and he watched them fail. Then, the communication request came in from the human vessel. He almost didn't take it. Not out of arrogance. He was past arrogance. Out of priority management. There was a crisis. Humans were a minor species with provisional Accord status and no seat on the Joint Fleet Council. His communications officer, a young Varek named Sari who had been on his staff for 40 years and who had learned to recognize the 17 different qualities of silence that Theres deployed, said, "Sir, the human admiral is asking specifically about consumption events." Theres went still. "Put her through," he said. Nakamura didn't waste time. She shared the file. All 17 entries. 43 years of Terran intelligence work, starting from the moment a human deep space probe had encountered the trailing edge of a previous Keth passage through a dead system. A system with no current inhabitants, but with the ruins of something that had once been an entire civilization, scrubbed down to bedrock with a thoroughness that no weapon Terran analyst had ever encountered could explain. They had been very quiet about the file, not because they wanted to hide it, because they had presented it to the Accord 3 times, and 3 times the Accord had thanked them politely and done nothing, and Terran intelligence had made the decision to stop sharing and start preparing. Theres went through the file in 20 minutes. He read fast. 6 centuries of command had required it. He pulled up the tactical section, the behavioral analysis, the one page buried near the end under the heading that his translator rendered as observe vulnerabilities. There was one entry. He read it twice, 3 times. "You found this," he said. Not a question. 9 years ago, Nakamura said, in the debris of the dead system. It took our analysts 4 years to understand what they were looking at. We've spent the last 5 building for it. How many ships? Nakamura looked out the viewport of a bridge. Beyond the glass, the Unconquerable hung in formation with the rest of the Terran Expeditionary Armada, assembled quietly over 5 years in the shipyards of Mars and Jupiter's Lagrange points, and the deep space foundries that the Accord's observation satellites didn't quite reach. 412 warships. Humanity's entire offensive naval capability. Every resource, every innovation, every lesson learned from 10,000 years of fighting each other translated into the language of space combat. It was, by Accord standards, a modest fleet. The Varek alone fielded 2,000 vessels. But the Varek didn't know about the vulnerability. 412, she said. And I'd like to talk to you about how we're going to use them. Because your fleet will not survive this engagement alone, Grand Admiral. I say that with respect. Your ships are extraordinary. They were built for every threat the galaxy has produced in the last 1,000,000 years. They were not built for this one. A pause. Mine were. The silence from Theres's end was long enough that she almost thought the connection had dropped. Then, I am transmitting fleet coordinates. How long until you can arrive at the assembly point? We're already there, Nakamura said. We've been there for 6 hours. We were waiting for you to call. Another silence. Different quality. You were waiting, Theres said. We've been waiting 9 years, Nakamura said. We knew you'd call eventually. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down again. Let's talk about how we're going to stop this. The Joint Fleet Assembly Point was a stretch of empty space between 2 systems that neither the Varek nor the Solin had ever thought worth naming. It had a Terran designation. Grid reference T, 9 Meridian. Nakamura's cartographers had tagged it 7 years ago as a potential defensive staging area, noted its geometric relationship to the 3 most likely Keth approach vectors, and filed it in the operational archive under a heading that her senior staff had taken a calling with the particular dry humor that seemed to be required for people who spent years planning for an enemy no one else believed in. The party nobody RSVP'd to. Now 1,400 ships were assembled there, and it looked like the whole galaxy had shown up at once. Varek, Solin, Thirik, Mali, 7 other species Nakamura could identify by hull configuration, and 3 she couldn't. Every member of the Galactic Accord had sensed something, moving with the desperate urgency of people who had just understood, in the space of a single hour, that they were not safe in a way they had assumed they were safe for their entire civilizational history. The Terran fleet sat at the edge of the assembly. 412 ships. Compact. Dark-hulled. The Varek vessels were enormous by comparison. Ancient, sweeping, built to the aesthetic of a species that had been perfecting starship design for longer than humanity had had writing. The Solin fleet shimmered at certain angles, their hull treatments refracting light in the particular way that made Solin vessels look like they were made of something between glass and water. The human ships looked like they'd been built to do a specific job, and nothing else. No ornamentation. Clean lines. The kind of functional ugliness that only made sense when you understood what they'd been designed to survive. Nakamura's chief of staff, Commander Hideo Rin, stood at her shoulder looking at the combined fleet on the display and said, very quietly, They're going to want to command this. Yes, Nakamura said. And we can't let them. No, that conversation is going to go well. Nakamura almost smiled. Rin had been with her for 12 years through 4 commands and 2 wars, and the particular sustained low-level crisis of being a human officer operating in galactic spaces where humanity was at best an afterthought and, at worst, a liability. He had developed a gift for understatement that she valued enormously. Set up the command conference, she said. All senior admirals. I want it in 20 minutes. The Varec may not accept a joint command structure with human co-leadership. They don't have to accept it, she said. They have to understand that without it, they lose. Grand Admiral Theres is 600 years old, and he's smart enough to read the file. He'll do the math. Rin went to set up the conference. Nakamura stayed at the viewport. Beyond the glass, the Ket's leading edge was still 11 hours away by best estimate, though their analysts had downgraded their confidence in that estimate 3 times in the last 2 hours because the Keth did not move at consistent speeds, and their sensor profiles kept shifting in ways that suggested they were not, in any meaningful sense, ships at all. The file's behavioral analysis was very clear on this point. The Keth were not a fleet. They were not even, strictly speaking, an army. They were something older and more fundamental, an event horizon with intention, a process that had been moving through the galaxy for longer than any currently living species had existed, eating what it found, not out of malice, but out of simple biological imperative, the way a wildfire isn't cruel, which was, Nakamura had always thought, the most terrifying thing about them. You couldn't negotiate with a wildfire. You couldn't threaten it or reason with it or appeal to its better nature. You could only understand how it burned and put something in its path that it couldn't consume. That was what the vulnerability was. 1 page, 1 entry. She had read it so many times in 9 years that she had the language memorized at a level below conscious thought, the way you memorize a prayer or a promise. Observed. Upon contact with target mass exceeding threshold density configuration X. 7. Keth consumption process enters self-inhibiting feedback loop. Duration, 4.3 to 7.1 seconds. During inhibition window, process is susceptible to directed disruption via resonance pattern weapons tuned to frequency range 447 to 891 GHz. 1 page. The work of 11 analysts over 4 years, reconstructed from the traces left in a dead system by a civilization whose name nobody remembered, who had figured it out too late, who had managed to scratch the answer into the fabric of their own destruction like a message in a bottle thrown into the void. Humanity had found the bottle. They had spent 5 years building the weapon. The problem was the threshold density configuration. The Keth needed to be concentrated before the weapon worked. And concentrating the Keth meant giving them something worth consuming. Something large enough to pull their entire leading edge into a single region of space. Something the size of a fleet. Nakamura had run the numbers herself, personally, without giving them to her staff, because her staff would have argued about them, and she needed to know the numbers without argument first. The decoy fleet needed to be big enough to attract the full concentration. Big enough meant, by her calculations, not survivable. Not in the normal sense. Not with any defensive posture she could generate. The ships that went in as the decoy would pull the Keth into formation, hold that formation for the window, take the brunt of the consumption process for 4 to 7 seconds, and then, if the resonance weapon worked, the Keth process would inhibit, and the strike fleet would deliver the disruption, and it would be over. The decoy ships would not, in most scenarios, still be ships by the time it was over. She had not put this in the briefing materials. She would need to say it out loud, in the command conference, to 14 senior admirals representing 12 species, some of whom had been commanding fleets for longer than humanity had had spaceflight. She was 39 years old. She picked up her empty coffee cup, looked at it, set it down. Rin, she said. He was already back. He'd heard her tone. Coffee, he said. It was not a question. Please, she said. And then the conference. Grand Admiral Theres had been in a great many command conferences over 6 centuries. He had seen cowardice and brilliance and mediocrity and the particular kind of desperation that settles over a room when the people in it understand that there is no good option, only different kinds of loss. He had never been in a conference run by a human. Nakamura he searched for the right framing and discarded several before settling on one. Precise. Not in the way that efficiency was precise, everything trimmed to save time, everything organized to prevent waste. Precise in the way a scalpel was precise. Each piece of information delivered at the exact moment it would land with maximum effect. No preambid, no questioning. She put the file on the table and let the room read it, and she watched 14 admirals, species ranging from the 600-year-old Theres to a Mali commander who was 1100 and had, by reputation, never lost composure in any recorded situation. She watched all of them go still. Then she explained the weapon. Then she explained the decoy requirement. The room was quiet for longer than Theres had expected. "You're describing," said Admiral Soren of the Solen's Sixth Fleet, one of the most decorated officers in Accord history, translator struggling slightly with the particular Solen tone that indicated controlled revulsion, a sacrifice. "I'm describing a tactical necessity," Nakamura said. "The ships in the decoy formation will be consumed. The ships in the decoy formation will hold a position long enough for the inhibition window to open. Whether they're still intact at the end of the window depends on how fast we move and how well the resonance weapon performs. And your assessment of that probability?" Nakamura looked at him. Her face did something Theres couldn't quite parse. Not the social regulation of concealment, which he recognized across species, but something more fundamental. The face of a person who has been carrying a specific weight for a long time and has learned to carry it without showing the load. "My honest assessment," she said, "is that approximately 60% of decoy formation ships will sustain catastrophic damage before the inhibition window closes. At full Keth concentration, consumption rate exceeds our best defensive modeling by a factor of 3. The room absorbed this. "You're asking us to send ships into something they cannot survive," the Mali commander said. Her name was Vel, and she was 1100 years old, and her voice was very flat. "I'm asking for volunteers," Nakamura said. "I'm not conscripting anyone. And if there are no volunteers?" "There will be," Nakamura said, "because there are people in every fleet in this room who understand what happens if we don't stop the Keth here. Your border worlds just lost 4 systems. 400 million on Veth Carol alone. If the Keth pass through this assembly point, there is no second line of defense. You all know what's behind us." Nobody spoke. Behind the assembly point in the Keth's current approach vector was the populated core of the Accord. 40 species, 11,000 worlds. The deep heart of everything the galaxy had built across millions of years of civilization. "I will lead the decoy formation," Nakamura said. The room's silence changed quality. "I will command the unconquerable at point position, closest to the Keth leading edge. We will have the best sensors. We will call the inhibition window. We will hold position until the window opens." She paused. "I'm asking for ships to form up behind me. I'm not asking anyone to do something I won't do first." Theres looked at her. 39 years old, the youngest being in the room by centuries. Species that had been in space for 200 years total. "The Varek First Armada," he said, "will contribute 40 ships to the decoy formation." The Mali commander said, 30 from the Mali Second. The Solen, the Varik, 7 other voices. Numbers accumulating. Nakamura let them speak. She did not thank them. Thanking them would have made it smaller than it was. When the room was done, she nodded once. "We have 11 hours, she said. "Let's talk formation geometry." Rin found her at 0200 hours in the ship's small officer's mess, eating nothing and staring at a display of the formation geometry that she'd already finalized 4 hours ago. "You should sleep," he said. "I know." He sat down across from her. He had known her for 12 years. He had learned specifically when to offer solutions and when to simply be present, and this was a when-to-be present moment. "They're scared," he said. "The other species, the Varek especially. I don't think they've been scared in, I don't know, centuries. They keep looking at our ships. What do they say? They're asking why our hull configuration is different, why our engines are oversized for our tonnage, why our point defense array has that second layer nobody's seen before." A pause. One of the Vera junior officers asked our chief engineer whether humans had been planning for this specifically, and she said yes, and the Varek officer went very quiet. Nakamura looked at the formation display. "We've been planning for it for 9 years, she said. "We found the debris. We ran the analysis. We decided the Accord wasn't ready to hear it, and we couldn't afford to wait for them to be ready." She paused. "We should have pushed harder. You pushed 3 times. "I know." She looked at her hands. 400 million on Veth Carol, and 3 other systems since. We knew this was coming, and we filed reports and attended meetings, and they tabled the discussion, and we went home and built ships and told ourselves we were being responsible. Her voice was level. It was very level, the kind of level that takes effort. 7 hours, she said. 6.5, Rin said. Estimates improved. It's moving faster. She stood up. The formation display was already memorized. She knew every ship, every position, every timing beat in the sequence. She had been running it in her head for 9 years, in one form or another. Wake the crew, she said. All hands. I want everyone at stations. You should eat something. She was already walking toward the bridge. After, she said. The Keth appeared on sensors at 0441 hours, and the first thing Nakamura thought was that the file had undersold it. The file had used clinical language because that was what analysts did. They measured and categorized and described in the precise vocabulary of scientific observation, because precise vocabulary was how you kept the thing you were observing at a manageable distance. The file said things like leading edge density exceeds modeled predictions by approximately 12%, and consumption radius observable at $0.30, and movement pattern consistent with biological process rather than mechanical propulsion. What the sensors were actually showing was a darkness that had its own geometry. It wasn't dark the way space was dark, the ordinary neutral absence of light that everything in the void existed inside. This was dark the way an answer is dark, a thing with weight and purpose and a direction that it was absolutely committed to. It moved the way a wave front moved, not individual objects, but a boundary between what had been and what was becoming. Ahead of it, stars, sensor returns, the normal electromagnetic noise of a living galaxy. Behind it, nothing. Not silence. Not emptiness. Not death. Just the absolute, clean absence of everything that had been there. It ate light. Not metaphorically. The Keth consumed radiation across the entire spectrum as a byproduct of their metabolic process, which was why there was no debris from the systems they passed through. No ruins. No molecular residue. No atoms left in anything larger than subatomic fragments. The dead system humanity had found 9 years ago had been dead for long enough that the immediate zone of consumption had moved on, and the subatomic fragments had had time to drift and diffuse and be detected faintly by the deep space probe that nobody had expected to find anything interesting. The Keth hadn't left ruins. They'd left nothing at all, which is a different and considerably worse thing. Range, Nakamura said. 2.4 AU, and closing, the tactical officer said. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Priya Desai, and she had been on the Unconquerable for 3 years, and her voice was doing the thing that voices do when they're being deliberately controlled. Consumption radius is holding at $0.30. Leading edge density, a pause. Leading edge density is significantly above file parameters, Admiral. How significantly? Approximately 40% above modeled maximum. Nakamura processed this. Smaller margin for dispersion. The window would still open. The physics didn't change, but everything that happened in the 60 seconds before it opened would be worse. She keyed her communication to the fleet. All fleet, all fleet. Sensor contact confirmed. Leading edge density is 40% above model parameters. Adjusting formation geometry as follows. She fed the adjusted coordinates to every ship in the assembly. Decoy formation, pull into designation Alpha, 2 spacing. Strike formation, hold at current distance, and prepare resonance weapon for deployment on my mark. She paused for exactly 1 second. This is what we trained for. Execute. In the Accord fleet around her, 1,400 ships began to move. The decoy formation coalesced behind the Unconquerable. 80 ships, pulled from every species contribution, including 40 Varec vessels that moved with the slow, sweeping grace of ancient civilizations and the particular dignity of things that had never expected to find themselves here. They formed up at Alpha 2 spacing, which was close enough that their shields overlapped, close enough that Nakamura could read the identifying numbers on the hull of the Varec vessel 3 positions to report. Behind them, at a distance of $1.20, the strike formation held. 1,230 ships, weapons charged, resonance arrays primed, waiting. Ferries' voice came over the command channel. Admiral Nakamura. I want you to know not yet, she said. Not harshly. Gently. Tell me after. A pause. Then, after, he agreed. The Keth leading edge crossed $1.50. The closest Nakamura could come to describing what happened next was to say that it was like being inside a storm while simultaneously being the lightning rod. The Keth didn't attack. That was the thing nobody in the Allied fleet was entirely prepared for, no matter how thoroughly they'd read the file, because every military mind in the room had been trained on conflict, and conflict has a grammar. There's an initiation, an exchange, a sequence of action and reaction. The Keth had no grammar. They had only appetite. The leading edge reached the decoy formation's outer perimeter, and the consumption process simply began the way digestion begins, not aggressive, not cruel, just mechanically, absolutely thorough. The outer ships, 3 Solin vessels and 2 Varek, began to lose hull integrity not from weapons fire, but from the simple fact that the Keth process was converting their mass into something else, the same way it had converted 400 million people on Vethkarel into the particular quality of nothing that the sensors behind the leading edge showed. The outer ships held position. They did not break. They had been told to hold, and they held because they had volunteered to be here, and they understood what holding meant. Nakamura watched the hull integrity readings on her display and felt something settle in her chest that she did not have a name for in this moment. Would not have a name for until later, much later, when she was sitting somewhere quiet and had the luxury of retrospection. It was the specific grief of watching people keep a promise you had asked them to make. Density concentration at 60% of threshold, Desai said. Her voice was very steady. 70, 80. The consumption process was pulling the Keth leading edge inward, the way any mass draws things toward itself, the formation's density acting as a gravitational analog for the Keth's metabolic targeting. It was working. The file said it would work. Nakamura had believed the file. She still felt something like stunned surprise that it was actually working, because 9 years of believing something in the abstract and the moment when the abstract becomes real are not the same place at all. 90%, Desai said. On the outer ships, the hull integrity readings were in free fall. 95. Admiral, Rin said from beside her. Just her name. Just that. I know, she said. Threshold, Desai said. Leading edge, at full concentration. Inhibition window, mark. For 0.3 seconds. The floor of the window. She needed it to last, at minimum, 4.3 seconds. Strike formation, Nakamura said. Fire. The resonance weapon was not, from the outside, impressive looking. This was intentional. The engineers who had designed it, drawing on 4 years of analysis of the dead system's residual traces, had understood from the beginning that the weapon's action was not kinetic. It did not throw mass or energy at the Keth. It broadcast a frequency. Specifically, a frequency in the range 447 to 891 gigahertz, tuned and modulated according to a pattern that matched, inversely, the metabolic resonance signature that the Keth generated when they were in full consumption mode. The principle was simple in concept and extraordinarily complex in execution. You find a frequency a fire burns at. You broadcast its opposite. The fire, encountering its own negative, briefly doesn't know how to be fire. For seconds was enough. 1,230 ships, spread across $1.20, broadcast simultaneously, their resonance arrays locked to the targeting solution that the unconquerable sensors had spent 60 seconds building from the inside of the consumption event. The Keth leading edge, the darkness with its own geometry, the boundary between what was and what wasn't, stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. It was by the sensors aboard every ship in the strike formation for 0.7 seconds. Within the upper range of the predicted window. For 0.7 seconds in which the darkness simply hung there, motionless, and the residual consumption process affecting the outer decoy ships ceased, and the whole universe seemed to hold a breath of the kind that comes before something that cannot be undone. Then, the disruption pulse hit. It was not, Nakamura would later explain to the inquiry board, a single dramatic explosion. Reality does not usually end things dramatically. The disruption pulse moved through the concentrated Keth mass at the speed of the frequency it carried, and, where it passed, the Keth metabolic process collapsed. Not violently, but completely, the way a fire collapses when you remove the oxygen, not with a bang, but with a sudden, total absence. The darkness stopped moving. The darkness began to, there was no good word for it. Disperse was too gentle. Dissolve was too slow. What it did was cease to be the kind of darkness that ate things and become the ordinary darkness of space, which is vast and cold and not particularly interested in consuming anything. In 6.2 seconds, the leading edge was gone. Desai's voice, when it came, had lost the quality of control. It was just her voice, and her voice was shaking. Leading edge dispersed. Consumption signatures, negative across all sensors. Strike formation, standby. A pause that lasted a full 4 seconds. Admiral, I'm reading clear. All sectors. The Keth signature is gone. Nobody spoke. The Unconquerable's bridge was quiet with the particular silence of a place where everyone has just survived something that they weren't certain they would survive, and nobody knows quite what to do with the fact of their own continued existence. Nakamura looked at the hull integrity readings for the outer decoy ships. Of the 80 ships in the decoy formation, 47 showed green, damaged, some critically, but intact. 22 showed amber, still functional, unclear recovery potential. 11 showed red. 11 showed nothing. 11 ships had been in the consumption event for 4.7 seconds and had not made it to the other side. 11 ships. 11 crews. Varric. Solen. The Rick. Terran. She pulled the count on the Terran vessel, the Defiant, out of the Mars Yard's crew complement of 312. She did not allow herself to linger on this number. She filed it. She would come back to it. She would come back to every name, eventually. The communication channels were erupting. Every species in the joint fleet simultaneously processing the same stunned realization. Theres' voice cut through first, directed to her personal channel, his tone carrying something she had not heard in it before, an absence of the particular ancient certainty that centuries of unchallenged expertise creates. Admiral Nakamura. Grand Admiral. A pause that was not discomfort. Something more complex. You were right, he said. About the file. About the preparation. About all of it. His translator struggled briefly with his next words, and she realized he was navigating something that 6 centuries of command had not given him vocabulary for. I owe you an accounting. My civilization owes yours an accounting. The 3 times you filed reports. We can talk about that later, she said. Right now, I need damage assessment on every ship in the decoy formation and medical response coordination across all species. She paused, and I need someone to confirm whether this was their entire leading edge or an advance element. Silence. Admiral, Desai said from the tactical station. Tell me. Desai pulled the deep sensor data on the main display. Her face, when Nakamura looked at her, was doing the controlled thing again. Long-range sensors are detecting a second formation, she said. Approximately 12 hours out. Nakamura closed her eyes. Open them. How large? Significantly larger than the first, Desai said. File does not have a comparable precedent. She paused. Admiral, it's 3 times the density of what we just faced. The bridge absorbed this. Nakamura looked at the display. The clear sensors, the dispersed darkness, the 47 surviving decoy ships, the 11 that were gone, the second formation sitting 12 hours out like a fact she had not yet been given permission to feel the full weight of. She turned her in. Give me Theres, she said, and give me engineering. I need to know how fast we can recharge the resonance arrays. At current power allocation, minimum 16 hours, Rin said. He had already run the numbers. She had known he would have already run the numbers. 12 hours until the second formation arrived. 16 hours to reload. She looked at the tactical display. She started thinking. 12 hours and 16 hours is not a math problem. It is a sentence with a very specific kind of ending. Nakamura had been doing military mathematics for 20 years, and she had learned to recognize the texture of problems that had solutions, and problems that were simply describing the shape of a situation you had to survive anyway. This was the second kind. The resonance arrays needed 16 hours. The Keth's second formation needed 12. The gap was 4 hours, and 4 hours was not a margin you could engineer your way out of with cleverness or dedication or the right allocation of resources. 4 hours was 4 hours. She sat with this for exactly 7 minutes, in her command chair, not staring at the display, but looking through it at something the display couldn't show her. Then, she called the Joint Command Conference again. The admirals assembled faster this time. They had just watched the impossible work, and the impossible working had done something to them, had cracked a particular professional composure that centuries of command experience builds into a thing so automatic it becomes invisible, and through the crack something rawer was showing. Not panic. Something more like the specific alertness of people who have just discovered that the rules they thought they understood are different from the actual rules, and who are not yet sure what that means. Nakamura put the 12-hour figure on the display. Then, the 16-hour figure. Then she waited. The silence was a different kind than the last conference's silence. This one had texture. She could feel them doing the arithmetic, each in their own way, arriving at the same place. There is no way to close this gap with current resources, she said. I want to be clear about that at the start. I'm not going to tell you there is a solution I've found. I'm going to tell you the options, and I want every mind in this room on the problem. She laid out what she had. The resonance arrays could be partially recharged by drawing power from non-essential systems, but that bought at most 2 hours. The decoy formation could be reconstructed, but with significantly fewer ships, the attrition from the first engagement and the damage to the survivors left them with perhaps 50% of the original decoy capability, which meant the concentration threshold would be harder to reach, and the window would be harder to open, and everything would need to be tighter and faster and more precisely timed. And the second formation was 3 times denser than the first. She put all of this on the display and watched it sit there. Grand Admiral Theres spoke first. If the resonance array recharge cannot be accelerated, we need an alternative disruption mechanism for the window. He looked at her. Your file documented only one vulnerability. Is there anything in the secondary analysis? Anything marginal? Anything your teams considered and dismissed? There are 4 secondary notes, Nakamura said. We dismissed them because they were either impractical at any useful scale or because the evidence for them was too thin to be reliable. Share them, the Mali Commandervel said. Her 1100 years sat very still around her. Nakamura shared them. The room went quiet in a way that meant people were thinking rather than absorbing, which was a different quality of quiet. She recognized it. She had sat in enough rooms with her own staff when a hard problem needed turning to find the edge. It was a Theric admiral she had not learned the name of yet, young by Theric standards, which meant 300 years old, who spoke first about the 3rd secondary note. This one, he said, highlighting it. Your team's note says the observed effect was inconsistent and may have been artifact. What was the sample set? One instance, Nakamura said. The dead system. A region approximately 3 kilometers in radius showed a different consumption pattern. Our analysts could not isolate whether it was a material property of the substrate or a localized frequency anomaly or something else entirely. What was in that region? Nakamura looked at the file. A dense metallic structure. We believe it was the remnants of a transit hub, a station, by the architectural markers, though it had been partially consumed. Partially, the Theric admiral said. He had the tone of someone who has just seen the edge of something. Not fully. Partially, Nakamura confirmed. We noted it. We could not explain it. We moved on. Dense metallic structure. He was talking faster. A transit hub. What is the metallic composition of a standard Varec transit hub? Theres looked at him. Primarily resonant alloys. The construction standard for high-traffic transit infrastructure uses alloys with a natural resonance frequency in the... He stopped. His voice changed. In the 700 gigahertz range. The room was very still. Nakamura looked at Theres. Theres looked back at her. The Varec fleet, she said, uses the same alloy in your primary hull construction. As a structural component, yes. Standard since before the current millennium. The resonance properties were considered incidental, a byproduct of the structural advantages of the alloy. Not a weapon, she said. No, he said, but it might behave like one, the Theric admiral said. If the Varec hulls generate a natural resonance in the consumption zone, if the density of Varec ships in a decoy formation is sufficient to create a localized frequency field, it would not have the precision of the designed resonance weapon, Theres said. It doesn't need to, Nakamura said. Her mind was moving very fast now, the way it moved when a problem that seemed closed suddenly showed a seam. The resonance weapon needs to be recharged because it's a design system with a design power requirement. Natural resonance from hull materials doesn't need power. It's passive. The Varec hulls have been broadcasting in the 700 GHz range their entire operational lives, and nobody noticed because nobody was looking for it. We would need the Varec fleet concentrated in the consumption zone, the Mali commander said. At sufficient density to generate a field strong enough to open the window, Nakamura finished. The room understood the full shape of this. All of them, simultaneously. Because concentrating the Varec fleet in the consumption zone was not a theoretical exercise. It was not a modeling problem. The Varec ships were not unmanned. The Varec First Armada was 2,000 vessels, and each vessel had a crew and concentrating them at sufficient density in a Keth consumption zone was an action with a very specific category of cost. The designed weapon opened the window in 4.7 seconds, Nakamura said. A passive field from hull resonance would be weaker. The window would take longer to open, potentially much longer. She looked at the table. I cannot model how much longer with any precision. The data is insufficient. It could be 30 seconds. It could be 3 minutes. The ships in that zone would be exposed to full consumption pressure for however long it took. Nobody spoke. The weight of what she was describing was present in the room the way the Keth darkness was present on the sensors. Not aggressive, just absolutely real. The alternative, she said, is that we cannot fully charge the resonance weapon in time. We cannot replicate the first engagement's conditions, and the second Keth formation passes through this assembly point, and everything behind it. She paused. 11,000 worlds. I have to say that number out loud. 11,000 worlds, and whatever lives on them. Theres was quiet for a long time. The Varec First Armada, he said, finally, has never been asked to do something like this. I know. We have never, in 600 years of my command, in the full history of the Varec people in space, we have never committed our fleet to an action with this category of outcome as a predicted result. I know, she said again. He looked at her. His species' eyes were different from hers, more complex, structured for different wavelengths, but the expression in them was something she recognized completely. Not fear, not courage. The specific, exhausted clarity of a being who has just finished arguing with a thing that cannot be argued with and has landed on the other side. I will need to speak with my crew, he said. You have 4 hours. I will need less than that. He needed 40 minutes. Nakamura used those 40 minutes to sit in the officer's mess with Rin and a cup of coffee she didn't finish and not talk about anything in particular. Rin talked about his family on Kepler Station because he had learned that filling his silence with something concrete and human kept her from disappearing entirely into the operational calculations, which she was capable of doing for so long that she came back to herself in a place she didn't quite recognize. She appreciated this about him. She did not say so because she did not have the vocabulary for it right now, but she thought it very clearly, and she thought he probably knew. When Theres came back, he came back with a number. Not the whole Varec First Armada. He had thought about it, had presumably calculated the same gap between the density requirement and the acceptable loss function, and he had arrived at a number. 800 ships. Enough, by the modeling that Nakamura's people ran in the 37 minutes between his departure and return, to generate a passive resonance field dense enough to open the inhibition window. Not in 30 seconds. Probably not in 3 minutes. The best estimate, which Nakamura filed away as a best estimate and, not a fact, was 90 seconds to 2 minutes. 2 minutes in a Keth consumption zone at the density the second formation represented. The modeling on what happened to 800 ships in 2 minutes of full concentration Keth consumption was not a number she looked at longer than she had to. The remaining Varec ships, Theres said, will form the strike component alongside the Accord fleet. When the window opens, everything fires. Everything fires, she confirmed. And if the window doesn't open in time, if the field is insufficient, if it doesn't open, she said, we fire anyway. The partially charged resonance arrays, plus the field effect, may be enough. The physics is, there is a reasonable chance. She said this with the precision of someone choosing words for their accuracy and not their comfort. There is also a chance it is not enough. I cannot give you certainty because I don't have one. Humans, he said, and it was not unkind, operate with a remarkable tolerance for insufficient certainty. We grew up on a planet that was trying to kill us, she said. It calibrates the risk appetite. He almost, she thought, smiled. The expression in his face made was not quite what a human smile looked like, but it was something in the same direction. The second formation appeared on sensors at 0612 hours, and it was worse than the first in the way that things are worse when you've already seen the shape of something, and the new version is simply larger, with no redeeming surprises. 3 times the density, moving with the same terrible patience. The Varec 800 held their position. Formation Sigma, that was what they named it. A Varec junior officer who had been in communications with the Unconquerables crew had come up with the designation, and everyone had used it without discussion because naming things was how you held on to them. Formation Sigma. 800 Varec ships in close formation, hull resonance broadcasting passively in the 700 GHz range, waiting. Nakamura watched the consumption zone advance toward them. She had nothing to do now that she had not already done. The plan was in motion. The resonance arrays were at 62%. Better than expected, her engineering team having found efficiencies in the secondary power draws that bought another hour and a half of charge time. 62% plus the passive field, if the field worked, if the window opened. All the ifs were already baked in. The outcome was somewhere in the future, happening or not happening on its own terms, completely indifferent to how much she wanted it to go a specific way. She watched the sensors. The consumption zone reached Formation Sigma's outer perimeter. And then she did something she had not done at any point in the preceding 14 hours of crisis management and tactical improvisation and the particular sustained load of being the person in the room that other people looked to. She held her breath. She did not decide to hold it. Her body just did it, the way bodies do things when the weight of an event is too large for the conscious mind to process in real time. 40 seconds. 60. The hull integrity of the outer Varec ships was degrading. The consumption zone was doing what it did. Not cruel, not intentional, just thorough. The Varec ships held formation with the precision of a civilization that had been flying in close quarters for millions of years and had made it into something close to art. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. Desai's voice. Low. Field density at threshold. Frequency readings. Admiral, we have inhibition signatures. She breathed. Confirm inhibition window, she said. Confirmed. Window is open. Partial, not full suppression, but sufficient. Admiral, fire now. Window will not hold long at this density differential. All fleet. Fire. Everything. Now. 1,200 ships. 62% resonance arrays. One passive hull frequency field from 800 ships that had just held a position they knew the cost of holding. Everything that humanity and 12 allied species had assembled in the T9 Meridian grid reference over 14 hours of desperate preparation. Everything all at once. The second Keth formation, 3 times the density, larger than anything in the file, larger than any previous recorded passage in any system humanity had analyzed, met the combined disruption pulse and the passive resonance field together, and the inhibition window stretched to 7.1 seconds. The very top of the predicted range, and in 7.1 seconds the full disruption hit the fully concentrated mass at the precise center of the consumption zone. The darkness stopped. The darkness began to disperse. It took 14 seconds this time, not 6.2. The formation was larger. The dispersal took longer. Nakamura watched the sensors for 14 seconds without speaking, without moving, watching the consumption signatures, the particular sensor signature that the file had labeled metabolic broadcast, and that everyone who had seen it in practice had privately called the sound of it eating. Watching those signatures drop and flatten. And then they were gone. Clean sensors in every direction. The ordinary darkness of space, profound and neutral and not hungry for anything. Formation Sigma. 211 ships still showing any signal at all. Of those, 94 were intact enough for recovery operations. She looked at that number for the length of time it deserved. All ships, she said. Commence rescue operations. Medical relay, all frequencies. Engineering support to any vessel showing amber or better. She paused. And give me a full casualty report. Every ship, every species. Another pause. I want names. The after-action briefing was 4 days later, in a conference room aboard a Varec medical station that had been deployed to the engagement zone, where the debris recovery operations were still ongoing and would be for months. 31 admirals. Every species. Nakamura sat at the center of a table that was slightly too large for a human to feel comfortable in, built for Varec proportions, and delivered the complete operational assessment to a room that was listening in a way she had never been listened to before by a group of beings with this much accumulated experience and authority. Not politely, not tolerantly. Actually, Theory spoke after her. He spoke for 40 minutes, which by Varec standards was extremely brief, and what he said was essentially a 600-year-old military mind working through, out loud, in front of 30 admirals, the question of how he had been wrong. Not tactically, not operationally, but in the deeper way that a civilization can be wrong, in the assumptions so fundamental that you do not think of them as assumptions, that sit below every decision like bedrock. Humanity had filed 3 reports. The Accord had declined to act on any of them. Thery said this clearly. He said it was a failure. He said the failure had a cost, and the cost had names, and he read some of those names from the casualty list, and the room was very quiet. Then, he said, we did not believe the humans because they were young, because they had been in space for 200 years, and we had been here for millions, and we assumed that the length of experience was the measure of its depth. He looked at Nakamura. We were wrong about that in a way that I think we will spend a very long time understanding. Nakamura did not say anything. She was thinking about something Rin had said to her 2 days after the engagement, when she was reviewing the casualty list for the 4th time, and he had sat down across from her again in the officer's mess, and waited until she looked up. He had said, what you're looking for in those lists won't be there. She had asked what she was looking for. Permission, he said, to have done what we did. She had not answered him. She was still not sure the answer existed, in the simple form that permission usually took. What she knew was that 11,000 worlds were still there. What she knew was that 412 Terran ships had gone into T9 Meridian and 409 had come out. What she knew was that Formation Sigma had held until the window opened, and that 800 Varrock ships had done something that 600 years of Grand Admiral Thery's experience had never asked of them, and they had done it anyway. She knew these things. She held them alongside each other, the way you hold things that don't resolve into a simple feeling. Because sometimes reality doesn't produce simple feelings, and the most honest response to it is to simply carry all of it at once. After the briefing, Thery's found her in the corridor outside the conference room. They walked together for a minute without speaking, in a way that people who have been through something together sometimes walk before there are words for what happened. The Accord will change its protocols, he said eventually. Regarding intelligence, sharing from non-senior member species. Regarding response timelines. Regarding, I'll file the formal recommendations, she said. My team has them drafted. Of course you do. She almost smiled. There will be a session, he said, to formally recognize the Terran fleet's contribution, and to discuss humanity's place in the Accord going forward. Senior membership. Full council representation. She nodded. For what it is worth, Thery said, and his voice had something in it that she thought, in this hallway, in this aftermath, she was finally hearing without the centuries of authority overlying it. Something simply personal, simply true. I'm glad you were there. I'm glad your people built what they built, even when we refused to listen. I'm glad you did not stop. She thought about 9 years. She thought about 3 reports, and the silence after each one, and the decision her people had made to stop reporting and start preparing. She thought about the engineers in the Mars yards and the analysts who had spent 4 years in a dead system's wreckage reconstructing an answer from nothing, and Rin who had sourced Colombian coffee from 3 colony worlds because she'd mentioned it once, and Formation Sigma. We couldn't stop, she said. That's the thing about humans. We are extraordinarily bad at stopping. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I know that now. She walked back toward the docking bay, toward the Unconquerable, which was already prepping for the return transit, already rotating crew through the post-engagement protocols, already receiving the new intelligence reports from the deep space arrays about the rest of the Keth passage vector, because the work was not done, would not be done for years, possibly decades, and humanity was constitutionally incapable of looking at an undone thing and walking away from it. Somewhere behind her, across 11,000 worlds, the lights were still on. She walked toward her ship.